Hello?
Hi, welcome to Rottweilers Then and Now. This is the only talk show that is all about Rottweilers. And today I'm very, very excited. I have actually two special guests. One guest is a longtime friend of mine, Dr. Michelle Amtower, and she's going to be the guest host today because I'm very excited to have Dr. Jaime Modiano of the, he is the lead coordinator, investigator at the Modiano Lab out of it's Michigan State University, I believe. Minnesota, thank you. I don't have my note in front of me, darn it. And that is one of the leading labs studying specific cancers in Rottweilers, along with other breeds. And a lot of us have many friends that their Rottweilers are actually involved in the study. So, kind of with that said, I am going to back out. I'm going to turn the show over today primarily to Michelle, Dr. Amtower, and ahead of time, thank Dr. Modiano for being our guest. He's very limited time, so we're not going to have any announcements. We're just going to get right down to the meat of the subject. Dr. Amtower, I am passing it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Jan. And thank you, Dr. Modiano, for being with us today. We're probably going to talk primarily on osteosarcoma, bone cancer, and Dr. Modiano has done some really interesting research in this area, one of which is supported by the Rottweiler Health Foundation. Dr. Modiano, can you talk a little bit about your research on the Aurora kinase inhibitors as some targeted drugs for bone cancer and markers with some of the gene therapy that you're using?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Jen, for the invitation. It's great to be here. And just as a note of veracity, I am at the University of Minnesota. We run a combined program through the College of Veterinary Medicine and the Comprehensive Cancer Center, the Masonic Cancer Center, and so we are really only one of 4 programs nationwide where we have this linkage of NCI-designated Comprehensive Cancer Center and a vet school on the same campus, and we are very, very excited about this stuff that's going on and the amazing support that we get from both places. So it's a terrific program that involves a lot of people, and I'm just a little cog in the giant wheel. Obviously, we can't do this without all the other great people here, the people that are in the trenches in the lab, and the people that are my colleagues, and the people that do our administrative support. So we're easy to find. The lab website is on the radio website, and it's basically modianolab.org. And so we do have a large emphasis on, so our lab is a cancer lab, and my training is in pathology, and as a pathologist, I've learned that if you want to really try to be able to treat disease, you have to understand what you're treating. So we try to get at the fundamental of why disease happens, what does it look like in its most intrinsic nature, and trying to find the weak link for the disease that we can attack to make the patient better and make the disease go away. And so that's basically our philosophy. A lot of things that we do are very basic biology and biochemistry, and the program extends all the way into translating some of our basic findings into the clinic and using those findings in dog patients and eventually, hopefully, in people patients as well. So in terms of the studies that you mentioned, the Aurora kinase study was actually a project that was started by one of our residents, and she took information from our lab where we had looked at what's called gene expression signatures or gene expression profiles. And so before Claire started this, we had collected information from many dogs with bone cancer where we looked at every single gene that is turned on or turned off in the tumors in a particular course of time. So it's like a slice through time for every tumor, and we look at all of the genes in that tumor at the same time. So that's about, 20-some thousand genes for each tumor. And obviously you need computational analysis to be able to do that. It's more than our small brains can handle, but we have access to amazing supercomputers and algorithms. And so we were able to derive what we call a molecular signature. We're able to look at patterns of gene expression where it wasn't only one gene or another gene. It was really a compilation of about 200 genes that could distinguish between two different subgroups of osteosarcoma disease. And this is information that is currently in the process of being accepted for publication, so I have to be a little cautious about what I say.
Right.
But the exciting part is that these two subgroups seem to show one major driver for why they were different. And in the past, one of the really challenging aspects of osteosarcoma, as a pathologist, we get a sample, and it's not a really hard diagnosis. But the question after you come up with a diagnosis that the owner and the vet want to know is, well, is it a bad one or is it a good one? And
Right.
with bone cancer, we know most of them are bad, but then there's normal bad and there's really, really, really bad. And so the question is, we don't really know how to separate bad from really, really bad. And then there's some that are not so bad, and we don't know how to separate those out either. And so it turns out that this genetic or molecular signature, and when I say genetic, I want to be very careful that it's not genetic in the sense of it being heritable. It's genetic in the sense that it's being defined by genes that are being turned on or turned off. Seem to be predictive for whether patients would do better or would do worse. And it seemed to be a little bit independent of treatment, meaning that if you compare dogs that have what we call the good signature or the bad signature that got comparable treatment, meaning pain control, amputation of their limb, or standard of care where they do amputation plus chemo, the good signature always did better than their counterpart bad signature with the same treatment. So that was kind of cool. And what's even cooler is that we've been able to actually extend that to look at osteosarcoma in kids. And what may be the first time we actually may be able to have a predictive signature. And we're now extending those studies into the mechanisms. And so we're trying to really understand why this happens and whether we can take what we have found as this large signature, and we can compress it into a laboratory test that could reliably be done as part of the diagnostic workup process. As you might imagine, trying to look at 20,000 genes in real time for a dog that gets diagnosed is not something that can be done on a 24-hour turnaround. But if we had a signature where we could look at 6 or 7, that would actually be something that could be done in the laboratory setting. And so that's something that we're moving forward with. But I digress. The question is what about the Aurora kinase? So Aurora kinase is a protein that is very important in cell division. And it was one of the hallmark genes, if you want to call it that was different between the two groups. And so the purpose of that project is to ask the question, so because this Aurora kinase seems to be central to the signature, is it driving the biology of the disease? What I mean by that is, do dogs that have a lot of Aurora kinase necessarily have a different course of disease progression than dogs that have less Aurora kinase in their tumor? And if that were the case, would an inhibitor of Aurora kinase help us improve the outcome for the dogs? Right. And so that's a question we're asking, and we were fortunate to have some really nice partnerships with pharmaceutical companies who have drugs that are very specific inhibitors of either one of the Aurora kinase or Aurora kinases are a family of related proteins. And so you can target one very specific one, or you can use drugs that target more of them. And these drugs are in clinical trials in people, and so the issues with toxicity and safety and whether or not the drug gets to where you want it and stuff have been pretty well worked out. So it gave us an opportunity to really go back and ask the very fundamental questions of, what happens with Aurora kinase and are the cells sensitive? And so this is a project that is still ongoing. It's really the research arm of Dr. Claire Cannon's residency. She is a fantastic individual. We are very, very lucky to have her. And so all I can tell you is that the work is in progress. There's some really interesting mechanistic data. And, research moves at its own pace. So unfortunately, things that started, last summer don't get done in 8 months. And so all I can tell you is that the data are ongoing. The system is working, and we just need to wait and see what the data tell us as to whether this is going to be a translatable therapy that might actually help dogs for which we would predict would have, better or worse outcome, or whether in fact this is going to be a targeted therapy that would be applicable to dogs in other settings or other subsets, not necessarily related to the signature, or whether this is going to be a therapy that unfortunately is not going to, be all that much help over what we know. And so that the answers to those questions are to be determined.
Okay. And how close do you think we are to, if this proves to be therapeutic, how close do you think we are to being able to use this in a clinical setting?
Yeah.
3, 4, or 5 years?
So if this proved to be to have good activity, and this is the same. Aurora kinase is only one angle that we're pursuing. We're not putting all our eggs in one basket because we don't think that's a great strategy. So we're pursuing a number of angles at the same time. And so if it's not Aurora kinase, we hope that one of the others we're pursuing will be good. But anyway, so if you find activity in the case of something like the Aurora kinase inhibitors, if we found activity in the test tube, we can actually skip, so to speak. We can do a very well educated and defined process where we don't have to take this through the process of testing in lab animals where we implant a tumor and then putting it into healthy animals that the FDA requires. This because all that's already been done. So this really is not is one of those things where the ethics of animal use for research, which we're very aware of, don't play a role because it's been done in the past, and so we don't have to worry about doing it again. And so something like this could go into the clinic quite quickly. And generally speaking, if you get the right enrollment and you can follow dogs that are where the owners are very committed and the funding is in place, and you can really follow the treatment as is designed to go through, you might be able to get through a dose-finding study in a matter of about 12 to 18 months, and then you can probably complete an efficacy study in dogs in probably 4 years. And so a therapy like this, where we didn't have to go through all of those developmental stages, we might have an answer of whether whatever we found in the laboratory translates to the clinic, at least for some subsets of dogs, in 3 to 4 years. A comparable study that we just finished last summer, and the data are being presented for the first time in public in May at the American Association for Immunologists meeting, was a gene-based immunotherapy which was supported by the National Cancer Institute and by the Canine Health Foundation, and it was run through a company called Apoplogic. And as full disclosure, I am a founding scientist for Apoplogic. So obviously, the company, if the therapy does well, the company does well, and so I just need to disclose that. But we completed that trial in it was run through 2 institutions, and it included 57 dogs, and like I said, the data will be out in May. And that took about, from the day we actually received the notice of grant award to the day where the data will actually be presented in public was about 4.5 years.
Okay.
So, with something where you are able to really go right to the clinic, that's not an unreasonable timeline.
Can I interject? We have a question from a caller. Dee, you're on the air. You have a question for Dr. Modiano?
I do. Good morning, Dr. Modiano. We've talked a couple of times. How are you?
Hi, Dee. I'm fine. Thank you.
Good. I was listening to what you were saying about the difference between this being genetic and heritable. So from what I'm understanding, it's a matter of certain circumstances combining to turn on a gene that then develops into cancer. And if it's not heritable, then it seems that there is really nothing substantive that we can do at this point, at least, to sort of breed it out of our program. Is that correct?
Okay, so let me repeat the question to make sure that we're on the same page, and I think I have an answer for you, and hopefully the answer will be a little bit more hopeful. So the question is, I made a very clear distinction between genetic events, meaning things that affect genes, and heritable events, which are where particular genes, forms of genes, versions of different versions of the same gene are inherited from mom and dad, sire and dam. And so in our case, in the study that I'm talking about, we did not specifically address heritability in the sense that even though we've been collecting tumors and samples from affected and unaffected dogs and families, this particular study did not look at familial relationships at all. We only looked at how the genes in the tumors were turned on or turned off. And so what turns the genes in the tumors on and off is really a combination of what you inherit and the environment that you live in. And by environment, I don't mean a toxic cesspool of, waste from the BP oil well. I mean, just the daily things that we do. And so we have to remember that...
And a combination of different things.
It's a combination of different things. And we have to remember that there's a very fundamental premise that I think is very important to understand, and that is tissues that divide a lot. So, as we basically live our lives every day, our tissues have to repair and renew themselves. We're not static. And some tissues go through more divisions than others. And tissues that go through a certain number of divisions tend to have a higher risk of cancer simply because as the DNA is replicating in those tissues, there is an intrinsic error rate. Our machinery that controls DNA is not perfect. And we acquire a lot more mutations in our cells through that mechanism of repair and regeneration than we do by exposure to almost anything, unless you happen to be in the immediate vicinity of a nuclear explosion, or unless you go to tanning beds every day, or unless you smoke cigarettes. We know that those are the major things that are very, very strong carcinogens that are solely environmental and that affect almost everyone, although there's also a heritable influence. But then the intrinsic ones are sort of insidious and imperceptible. And so one of the reasons that big dogs, for example, get more bone cancer than little dogs is that during the course of growth, from puppyhood to adulthood, it takes a lot more cell divisions to make a big bone than it takes to make a little bone. And one of the things that we learned early on, and most of you probably feed your dogs a big dog type of food, and what that does is it actually has lower caloric value so that it retards the time, or it delays the time until which dogs reach their full size and mass maturity. And by slowing down the rate of cell division in the bone, we can actually reduce the risk of bone cancer. And so we don't eliminate it. The reduction is, I don't have a number for percent, but it's one thing that we've been able to do that says, if you make a lot of these divisions go very fast, in a very short period of time, your risk is higher, and if you slow them down a little bit, the risk is lower. And so that includes both the heritable risk of having to make big bone, as well as the environmental risk of how quickly you divide. And so the same is true for any cancer, and the same is true for bone cancer. There are some heritable traits that are going to elevate the risk, and there are some heritable traits that are going to reduce the risk. And so there are two things that I will tell you. In collaboration with Dr. Sharston Lindblad-Toh at the Broad, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and with Dr. Matthew Breen at North Carolina State University, we are conducting, and we is a proverbial we, this is really being led by Sharston and her group at the Broad, are conducting a study to look at heritable traits that influence bone cancer risk in several breeds, including Rottweilers. And some of the data have been presented in preliminary formats at various meetings. There are now some really robust data that Sharston's group are starting to prepare for publication. And I can't really tell you a lot about it other than to say it's not simple. But what we're hopeful about is that this will actually give us some clues to things that modulate risk, and then we have to figure out how they modulate risk, and can we try to modulate those, to breed those out essentially, to reduce the risk down to a more acceptable level. It's probably never going to go away, but can we make it lower and lower without giving up the traits that make a Rottweiler a Rottweiler? So there are some things about Rottweilers that you know and you love and you want to maintain. And so we want to basically keep all those desirable traits and do things that can reduce the risk of bone cancer and other diseases that Rottweilers get. And so there is a heritable component, and you know exactly what that component is yet to be determined, but it's there. So the other thing that we found that was interesting is that when we look at these molecular subgroups, we know that one subgroup is also strongly influenced by being a Rottweiler. And again, I have to be careful in what I say because of the rules of publication and so on. But it did become a question as to whether Rottweilers intrinsically are at risk for getting worse disease than not Rottweilers. And that's a question that a lot of people have asked in different forms in the past, either rhetorically or scientifically. And so I can tell you that there was a scientific study that was really nicely done, even though it's just looking backwards. It was retrospective. What people did is they went through the medical records of 3 institutions, if I remember correctly. I think it was Davis, Penn, and Michigan, if I remember correctly. And they looked at the records, and they looked at Rottweilers that had come to those institutions and been diagnosed with bone cancer and that had been treated using a particular type of treatment. And then they looked at non-Rottweilers that had a comparable diagnosis in a comparable time frame with the same treatment. And they asked, can we use this information to tell whether Rottweilers, as a rule, do worse, whether they have shorter survival than other dogs? And the answer to the question in their hands was no. So by the time we diagnose the disease, even though we see it a lot in Rottweilers, and even though there might be a perception out there that Rotties tend to do poorly with chemo or with whatever, when they looked at the hard data, the answer was no, Rotties don't do any worse. I mean, the distribution is exactly the same. There's some portion that are going to do really bad, some that are going to actually do quite well, and some in between. When we looked at our data, despite the fact that Rotties tended to go into one of our molecular groups, if we looked at outcome, Rotties and non-Rotties were no different. And so what that tells us is that there are a couple of different components that separate these tumors out, and one of the components is determined by how the tumor behaves, bad or badder, or maybe not so bad, and the other component, and the other component is being a Rottweiler. But those two are not; they don't seem to be interrelated. And so the good news is that yes, being a Rottweiler is different than being a non-Rottweiler in many senses of the word. So, if you have a Rottweiler, it's not a St. Bernard, and it's not a Greyhound, and it's not a German Shepherd, and it's not a Mastiff. It's a Rottweiler. And its tumor behaves, like a Rottweiler, but that doesn't necessarily mean the tumor is going to be worse. And so we do have actually opportunities to start addressing the question of heritable risk and or heritable progression, independent of how we actually try to manipulate these tumors to treat them. So I don't know if that answers your question or if that is clear.
Sort of. So can I follow up with one question?
Go ahead.
Is there a test looming in the future, foreseeable future?
Is there a test to determine risk?
Like a genetic test?
Is there a test to determine risk in the foreseeable future?
If a dog is genetically predisposed to getting osteosarcoma.
Correct. Okay, so the question is maybe the better maybe a different way to phrase the question is there a test that you can use to find out if a dog who would be bred would be prone to producing offspring that were at high risk for developing osteosarcoma? Because obviously the question of whether a dog is going to get it or not is you know, you might be able to assign some level of risk, but it's very unpredictable. And one of the things that I find is at least today a little bit unethical to do that if you don't really know. So let me put the question a different way. If we were able to test a dog and say this dog has a 90% chance of getting osteosarcoma, the question then is, what are we going to do about it? You know, I mean, we can't go out and amputate all of its bones prophylactically. And so I think it creates unnecessary stress, and it you know, it's not a good thing. But I think the question posed a different way, which is, if we bred this dog, would this dog's offspring or would this bitch's offspring be at high risk for osteosarcoma? Then that allows you to do an intervention, which is decide if that dog should be in the breeding pool or not. And so today we don't have a test to do that. And so what we tell people is, when you make your breeding decisions, you make the breeding decisions based on facts, based on things that you can grab in your hands and put your arms around. And so if you know that a particular dog or bitch have traits that you really would like to see in another generation, then there's your answer, right? And if there are traits that you think should not be passed on, then there's your other answer.
And right now we
fully intend to take the data that we have and try to narrow the markers that we have down to be able to assign risk. And risk can define both tumor starting, or it can define tumor going from undetectable to clinical problem. That one is hard to separate, but you know, risk really defines whether an animal is likely to die from this disease or not, or have bad morbidity from this disease. It is fully our intention to be able to take the data that we have and put it into tests like that for Rottweilers and Goldens and Greyhounds and Mastiffs and all of these other breeds of dogs for whom we are studying cancer-related biology and risk. And so, you know, I guess I can't answer the question of whether it's looming because we don't really know what the markers would be. But I can tell you that I'm confident we will find data that will allow us to construct those types of tests. And then, of course, the question is, if you select for those markers, what are the unintended consequences? And so there may be a test available that would actually be able to tell you some level of risk within a decade. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to say. The question is whether that test would actually be something that you would use to guide breeding decisions is something that we won't know until we actually know what the test is and what the risk factors are. Because, you know, obviously you don't want to give up one bad risk to acquire one that is worse. And so we are committed. We are excited. We think we can achieve that goal, but it is you know, there's a fair amount of unpredictability in what's going to happen. So I think the short answer to your question is, we're going in that direction. We want to make it available. We hope it works. And
I was going to say thank you, Dee, very much.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Dr. Modiano. Okay.
Yep.
Bye.
Okay, so that took a couple questions off my list. In discussing the research that you're doing to identify the dogs that respond poorly, the dogs that do okay, or the dogs that do great, have you seen any proof that amputation sort of triggers the metastases on these dogs? One orthopedist told me that it seems as though once a dog has osteosarcoma, once a Rottweiler has osteosarcoma, that the amputation really triggers or kicks into high gear the cancer itself.
Yeah.
And
so
you want to get the chemo started very, very soon to sort of start squashing those metastases.
Yeah. The question is whether amputation might accelerate, taking away what we consider the primary tumor, might accelerate the development of metastasis. And so the first thing to recognize is that in order for the metastasis to even get accelerated, they have to be there already. And so the question is, we know that by the time we diagnose osteosarcoma in almost all dogs, by the time we actually see the tumor or clinical signs, that tumor has gone other places besides the original bone where it started. Mm-hmm. And so the reason to do something besides amputation is because you have to attack those cells that have spread to other places, mostly lymph nodes and lung, but other bones, and they can basically go anywhere. And so the hypothesis that taking away a primary tumor might accelerate metastatic disease really came from work that was done by Judah Folkman at the NCI. And so Judah Folkman, for people who don't know the name, is the guy who discovered tumor angiogenesis, the fact that tumors need a blood supply in order to be able to grow, survive, and disseminate. And so when they go places, one of the first things that they do is they recruit blood vessels to come in and be able to feed them. So, when Dr. Folkman first proposed that in the late 70s, people literally laughed him out of rooms, and now, of course, it's a major modality, but whereby people are trying to really control cancer, and it really is an intense area of study. And so, one of the things that Dr. Folkman observed early on in his research was that big tumors make things that prevent the formation of new blood vessels in distant tumors. So it's almost like the big tumor was really selfish and wanted to keep all the blood vessels to itself. And all the kids that went out and set up homes somewhere else, the big tumor didn't really want them to do well, and so it kept them from being able to develop this blood supply. And so what Folkman showed is that if he took away the primary tumor, this inhibitory effect was gone, and now the metastatic sites could start recruiting blood vessels and make their own, little nests and niches and grow into being big, ugly metastases. And so this actually was very reproducible in certain laboratory models. The question was, and is, whether this really happens in real life. Mm-hmm. And the data are not straightforward. It's controversial. And so whether or not what we do know about osteosarcoma. So now if we go out of the hypothesis and the lab-based, bench evidence, and we go to the clinic, we know that virtually every dog that has osteosarcoma in its limb will have some degree of microscopic metastasis, if not big metastasis, by the time we diagnose it. So if the dogs already have big metastasis, the treatment is totally different, because it almost becomes a question of ethics as to whether or not you should take off the primary tumor, and that has to do with pain control and what other criteria are there, right? If there's no visible metastatic disease, we do all the stuff we know how to do and we don't see it, the question is okay, we can take off the primary tumor assuming the dog is structurally sound, meaning it can ambulate in 3 limbs and it will have good quality of life. Mm-hmm. And then how do we delay or prevent those micrometastatic cells that are out and about in the body from becoming bad tumors that are going to kill the dog? And the only way we know how to do it, and let me repeat that because I want to make sure that's underscored, the only way we know how to do it today is by using chemotherapy. So I think Jan put it on the notice, and Michelle might want to reiterate it. I am not an oncologist. I'm a pathologist. My job is to do diagnosis. I don't do treatment, but I work with oncologists enough to know that today, as I'm speaking, there are no other proven treatments that have been shown to be beneficial to prevent or delay metastatic disease in osteosarcoma. And so as far as when you apply chemo, I think my experience, and again, I'm not an oncologist, and so I don't treat these guys every day, but we have these discussions when we design our clinical trials, which is, when do you give chemo before, when do you give chemo after, and if you do it after, how long after surgery do you do it? And so if you look at what they do with kids, in kids the objective is to save the limb almost at any cost. Not at any cost, because, if it comes to arm or leg or life, you always try to keep life. But because they want kids to be very functional and be able to do all the things that kids do, they work really, really hard at preserving the limb. And so what they do with kids is they give them chemo first, and they try to really shrink that tumor as much as they can to make the surgery easier in terms of being able to remove that mostly dead tumor and then putting in a graft and trying to save the limb. And then they give chemo after. So the other thing that's different for kids is that, they're getting the disease when they're in their teens. And ideally what we'd like for them to do is to be able to live until they're, 120. I come from a nice Jewish family, and we always said, may you live till you're 120. So that seems to be a good number. And
okay.
so
that sounds good.
And so there's really a long life out there. And so if you say we're going to do stuff that's going to make you feel really crummy for a matter of days or weeks, but in the end that may buy you 60 years of life, that's not a bad deal.
Right.
So when we think about our dogs, most of our dogs get the disease when they're older, and that in itself is a really interesting question for us and a lot of other people. Why is it that dogs get it when they're older, and in people mostly occurs when they're young? I don't have a good. I can make up a lot of answers. I don't have a really good one. But in dogs, so if you have a 9.5-year-old Rottweiler, that's the median that we see. And you say, I could give him really, really, really aggressive chemo where he's going to have to be in ICU for 2 months before we take out his tumor. Then we take out his tumor, and then I'm going to give him chemo where he's going to be in ICU for 6 months after that. The question is, well, by the time you're done with the therapy, he's 10
quality,
right? And so, I mean, he had really bad quality of life for that time, and then how much are you going to buy him? And so we try to be very realistic, and what we want is just like physicians and pediatricians want kids to go out and throw baseballs. We really want dogs to go out and catch frisbees or chase squirrels or, do what dogs do. And so I think in essence, the compromise has been that dogs can do most of those things relatively well on 3 legs, again, assuming they're structurally sound, and that by giving chemo after the fact, we can extend life. The expectation, so if you're going to flip a coin and say, what's my 50-50 chance, it's about a year, okay? So about half of the dogs will be alive at 10 or 11 months. And so in a dog that's 9.5, that's not really terrible. In a dog that's 2.5, then the odds really change, and you want to start looking at other options, maybe. And so when to start chemo, I think there's no hard and fast rule. We have seen in cases where you biopsy the primary tumor that after the biopsy the tumor gets really angry and it goes through a massive growth spurt, and we normally don't consider that to be a really bad thing because we know the tumor is going to come off anyway. And so if it decides to get angry and grow really big, we can control the pain, and we're going to take it off anyway, but we decide the biopsy may be necessary for some reason. And so that part we see. As far as whether dogs that undergo amputation grow mets more rapidly, I don't think that's something that would be a consensus opinion. I think that some people might have that experience and some people might not. But generally speaking, if
just
you...
anecdotal.
Yeah, I think anecdotally you definitely have some dogs where the mets seem to be really quiescent, then you take out the tumor and then they go boom, they really explode. So I think it does happen anecdotally, but I don't think it is something that happens generally speaking in every dog with osteosarcoma. And I think that the treatment decisions as to whether to do pain control, whether to do only amputation or whether to do amputation and chemo are very, very individual. I think people need to consider all the options, and the options really are different for every single dog. This is not, the things are on the menu, and the things that you get from the menu are really going to depend on that particular case. There's no prescribed thing that says this is the way you treat every osteosarcoma because the circumstances are always different. And in our case, quality of life and finances are very important.
Right.
Okay, we have a question that came in from the chat lines. Joe, you're on the air with your question.
Dr. Modiano, and this may be something you are unable to answer at this time, but can you give us any kind of a correlation between seeing the osteo compared to, say, lymphoma and other forms of cancer in the dog? Has there been any kind of a comparative study that shows the prevalence for more than one type?
That is a really good question, and the answer is out there, and I don't have it off the top of my head. So there are several publicly available breed health studies. The one that I'm most intimately familiar with, not because I participated, but because we've come through it extensively, is Larry Glickman's study on golden retrievers that was released in 1999-2000, and it had done interviews with owners of Goldens from about, I think it was like 1,600 dogs or something, many households represented. And in Golden Retrievers, the statistics at the time, which I think are probably very closely reflective of what happens in the breed, or what happened in the breed then and what happens now, is that about somewhere close to 60% of Goldens at the time, at least from the respondents of the survey, had died of cancer. So that's a pretty big number. That's a bigger number than we would expect to be just by chance. Sort of the chance number that we would predict from all dogs and what we know about all people would be closer to the 30 percentile. So 60 percentile is big. And the other thing that Larry found is that most of the deaths in Golden Retrievers that were attributable to cancer came from two major types of tumors, hemangiosarcoma and lymphoma. That was not really a surprise to the veterinary community because people have known anecdotally and by experience that Goldens get lymphoma and hemangio. There's some interesting discussions coming up between vets in the U.S. and Europe, where there is this myth that dogs in Europe don't get cancer, and it is a myth that they do. But it is kind of interesting that dogs of the same breed in these two populations might have slightly different risks for certain different cancers. And so, you know, that goes back to the whole heritable thing. So there are data out there looking at different types of cancers in single breeds. There are a couple of published health studies that were done in Rottweilers. One was done by Margaret Slater, and the other one has been published in parts by David Waters' group. And so Don Cooley published the data on the neutering study in the early 2000s, and Margaret's data was from a much smaller cohort, but had some interesting findings. And what I can't remember about Margaret's study was, you know, and I have a hard enough time remembering the stuff that's going on in my lab, much less everybody else's. But what I remember from Margaret's study was that the proportion of Rottweilers that were being diagnosed or had died of cancer was also higher than what you would expect from random chance. So the breed does seem to have a higher risk of developing or a higher risk of cancer progressing. And while osteosarcoma was one of the big ones, I think there were a couple others that were not quite as prevalent as osteo, but were definitely in there. And so our original study, for which we started collecting samples 12 years ago, was designed around the premise that if we looked at Goldens and Rotties, we had an almost perfect reciprocal relationship between the risk of lymphoma and osteo. So lymphoma in Goldens has a risk of about 12.5% for lifetime, right? So that if you look at the lifetime risk in 100 Goldens, maybe about 12 to 15 are going to get lymphoma, and maybe 4 or 5 will get osteosarcoma. And then if you looked at Rottweilers, the number was kind of a guess, and it seems to be holding up. About 15 or so Rotties out of 100 might develop osteosarcoma in their lifetime, and about 5 might develop lymphoma. And so those numbers really seem to be, it turns out that our guess was probably pretty close. And so doing the comparisons across these breeds, we could try to figure out what's similar and what's different. And what we're finding is that the differences are a lot starker than the similarities. So it seems like there's multiple different ways in which dogs can get to develop these tumors, and some of those things are embedded in what we've done for selection. I don't think we've done bad things, but I think it's just a matter of what you do when you have a breed. And again, it goes back to, can we reverse some of those judiciously while maintaining what makes a golden retriever, and what makes a Rottweiler a Rottweiler. So some of the data are out there, but I don't have it at my fingertips.
Dr. Modiano, and Dr. Amtower, you have about 4 minutes left, and we will be cutting you loose due to your busy schedule. So there's about 4 minutes.
Just one last question for you. In the last few years, what do you think has been the most significant development towards osteosarcoma treatment?
Boy, that's a hard question, because I think
different chemotherapy protocols.
This is a question where I think we still need a little bit of a crystal ball. I think that we haven't made, in humans and in dogs, we haven't made huge tractions in treatment for 30 years. So what we do now is what we did 30 years ago. We just know how to do it a lot better. And so I think it shouldn't be understated that when we started using chemotherapy in dogs 30 years ago, we as a profession, there was a lot of trial and error, and there was a lot of really bad side effects. And nowadays, there's a lot of success stories, terrific success stories, and the side effects are usually very, very controllable to minimal. And that's just a tribute to the oncologists and the practitioners in the trenches that have gone through a lot of trial and error and learned how to use the drugs to maximize their benefit. And so I think that it's really no coincidence that little by little we've pushed the expected survival time, that sort of 50-50 expectation, from a few weeks to a few months to very close to a year. And so I think that has been something that people tend to overlook, because that expectation is now so ingrained, and people forget that a few years ago it wasn't really that. So I think we shouldn't minimize the advance that we've made with the things that exist. Biologically, we know a lot more about osteosarcoma, and there are so many studies coming out with targeted therapies that attack either the tumor itself or its microenvironment, or that boost the immune system to respond against this disease. And there are a lot of really exciting things going on. And, as is true with science, many of them will be based on fundamentally great ideas, but will fail. And they may fail because the idea was great, but it didn't consider everything else that we didn't know at the time, or because the way in that it's implemented may not be exactly the way in that it should be implemented. Maybe the drug was given every 2 days instead of every 4, and we have no way to really control for those things. So some of these things will fail, but undoubtedly some of them will succeed. We're seeing success in targeted therapies for things like leukemias and breast cancer and other tumors in humans, and we're translating those to dogs. And so, it is fair to ask, there's a lot of people now that are trying to look at whether Palladia, our new magic targeted therapy that hits tyrosine kinase receptors, is going to improve the outcome of dogs that have osteosarcoma with chemo. Time will tell. That it's a great question. It's one that makes a lot of sense. But the question is when would you give the Palladia, in combination with the chemo, first, at the same time, later? And so, and there's a lot of other therapies that are coming online. There's a lot of trials out there for osteosarcoma. The Comparative Oncology Trials Consortium has either completed or has in progress no fewer than 7 or 8. So this is one that is near and dear to our hearts. It's one that we have a lot of new information to attack the disease with, and it's one that we think is a huge priority, and we want to make a difference. So I wish that I could tell you more. I wish that I could say we have a therapy that we know is going to work a lot better. Stay tuned. There may be a little bit more about that in May. Dr.
Modiano, I hate to do this to you, because I could just sit here and listen to you for the the rest of the afternoon, but it is 10 minutes before the hour. I promised I would cut you loose.
And I do have another meeting to go to, yes.
Exactly. I gave you my word, so it's very hard interrupting you. You have no idea.
Well, at least we ended in a good note. I think the answer to the question is the standard of care is the best we know how to do today. I'm thinking in the next 3 to 5 years, the menu of options for things that we can do is going to be greater and hopefully better.
And can I have you back?
If anyone out there has any dog with currently diagnosed osteosarcoma, please go to Dr. Modiano's lab.org, his website, and look into the details on how to submit a sample for your veterinarian.
Absolutely. And I want to, one quick question, and it shouldn't take long to answer. Can I possibly have you back later this fall after the research has been published?
I will do my best. I will do my best. So just contact me and we can try to set a date.
Okay, that is great. Thank you so very, very, very much for being with us today.
Thanks to both of you. Thanks to everybody behind the scenes, and thanks to all the listenership for taking the time to listen to us rant and dribble about things that we're excited about.
That's great. And you may go ahead and hang up now, Dr. Modiano, and good luck on your next meeting coming up in 8 minutes now.
Thank you. I am running as we speak.
Okay. You bet. Bye-bye. Michelle, Dr. Amtower, I really so appreciate this. I love this show because I could actually listen and not be taking notes and determining what I had to ask again. And those of you that have called in and listened and they're on the chat lines or just on the website and listening, it has been it's sometimes over one's head discussions that I'm going to be hitting the books on a few things that he mentioned, but it was absolutely fascinating, and I can assure you I will have him back after their research has been published so that he can freely talk about their findings, be they good, be they bad, or indifferent. That I can promise. So that's this unique day on Friday was because this was the only time he was able to schedule and wedge in the time that he has. So before we go, the only announcements I'm going to make, and you did bring it up, Dr. Amtower, is that go to Modiano Lab, that's MODIANO lab.org, and see the research they've been doing, learn a little bit more about it, and if you get a pencil, have it handy, or open up an email. If you're sitting at your computer, which you obviously are, open up an email and take this phone number, 612-626-6890. Now, that's the phone number to the Modiano Lab, and if you have a dog that has just recently been diagnosed with any of the cancers that were mentioned today, call them right away. You got a diagnosis yesterday, because the earlier they can get swabs and samples in, the better it enhances their research, and they can follow along with the dog. So it's really important. They have a delightful staff. They're great to talk to. So that phone number one more time is 612-626-6890, and the website is modianolab.org. And with that, I wouldn't be having Dr. Modiano on the show today had it not been really for the Rottweiler Health Foundation. And maybe most of you are familiar with it, and those that you are not, it is a nonprofit organization set up several years ago, and you can contribute any amount to the Rottweiler Health Foundation, and they fund research such as you just heard Dr. Modiano talking about. They have been sending grants to Modiano's research and other cancer researches and other medical scientific research programs. So, if you even have $5, please consider donating to Rottweiler Health Foundation. And their address is, and if you have that email open, their address is Rottweiler Health Foundation, 580 NW for Northwest, 47th Street. That's 47th Terrace in Deerfield Beach. Deerfield, one word, Beach, Florida. The zip code is 33442. And consider, if you consider estate planning. The Rottweiler Health Foundation, they send out large chunks of money to help do research, to study the diseases that's in our breed. And this is one way where you can really help those of you that are planning your estates. Consider a nice donation to go to the Rottweiler Health Foundation. Where your money goes, it's all volunteers there, and every cent that is donated is used for research such as what Dr. Modiano talked about today. So I can't stress that enough. I really, really can't. Today I had no intentions of any other announcements, but I do have just a couple of minutes remaining, and now I'm going to plead for me. As you know, those that have been listening on a regular basis since we started we're going on 4 months ago now, every so often I have audio problem, a little garbling here and there, or just audio difficulty, and I have been informed what type of microphone I need for this type of programming. And so, anybody out there, if you are really enjoying these shows, and I have some super ones equally as good as this lined up, feel free. I'll accept donations. I'll accept sponsorship, and help me get the microphone I need. And also, if you have, I will take litter announcements. And also announce, club events or anything coming up. And I'm cheap. I tell everybody, I'm cheap. We all know that. So with that, folks, I'm going to let you go. Dr. Amtower, again, I cannot thank you enough for being there. Joette, Vicki, I couldn't have done it without the two of you monitoring things behind the scenes for me. And, they're the real workers. They're the one that stays behind the scenes and help me be able to do what I do, which is talk. And I do that very well. So with that, I'm going to say, please hug your Rottweiler today. Support Rottweiler Rescue, and go over to Rottweiler Health Foundation, Rottweiler Health.org, and consider a donation to the foundation there, and check out ModianoLab.org. You will find it very rewarding if you can help save our dogs. So with that, talk to you next Tuesday. The Colonial Rottweiler Club is the featured club. Bye-bye.